The Winnipeg Jets certainly have an abundance of wingers, but they still have big questions around Nik Ehlers and even Dmitri Rashevsky. Let's talk about those on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to this August episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, Winnipeg has a bit of a winger problem. In fact, it's not really a bad problem. It's more like I would say, uncertain level, or a level of uncertainty with a number of some of their young talents and maybe some of their established veterans. Wingers are one of those funny things where the Jets have lots of them, but where they play is kind of a bit of a question. Chief among those questions is what happens with Nik Ehlers, a guy who's been apparently shopped this offseason, and it's not the first time the Jets have apparently been fielding offers. It sounds like for the last few years, the Jets have been quietly offering him in some sort of an exchange. There was a rumored trade with Philadelphia several years ago that would have sent him in exchange for Rasmus Ristolainen, and all I can tell you is I'm very glad that didn't happen. For Ristolainen, that would have probably have been a really, really bad return, and I think the Jets would have immediately regretted that trade. So Winnipeg, sometimes they make some questionable decisions, and I think that would have been very high up there in my mind as a move that you just don't really want to make, if we're being honest. I mean, no disrespect to our guy Ristolainen. He's a good player in some respects, but certainly not for the kind of caliber of player the Flyers would be getting in exchange. So in terms of Winnipeg, right, I guess one of the other questions is if you're not really getting the offers that you like and you're not really seeing much in a way that satisfies what you're asking for, which is probably some sort of a roster player in return, do you try to convince Ehlers, and is it even worth doing that? We'll talk about that in just a moment, but before we go too much further, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because as the playoffs wind down and our favorite sports stop sporting the way we like them to, well, FanDuel totally gets it. They want you to help keep your summer hotter than ever, and they're hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, the Ehlers question for me is a very big one because it really dictates what's going to happen to the top six, and it also dictates what happens with guys like Brad Lambert. We've talked a lot about whether Lambert starts at center or winger, and if Ehlers goes, immediately you have a huge left wing vacancy that, let's be real, your most natural fit's probably going to be somebody like Lambert. I don't know if Lambert, Scheifele, Velarde would be the line that they would go with immediately. I can almost guarantee you we're going to see something where Connor and Scheifele play together, because that continues to be the duo that I think Scheifele himself pushes for, and whether I like it or not, well, it is the thing that they continue to do. Maybe Arniel will change that, but in terms of Ehlers, right, I guess the biggest question is, can you convince him, and is it worth convincing him to resign? And I've gone back and forth on this a lot, because on the one hand, Ehlers brings a really rare set of skills that the Jets just do not have. Transition offense, his skating, his puck carrying, his zone entries. He does so much that goes under the radar that is really hard to replace. There's just not many players out there who do the amount of volume work that he does. And a lot of people will often look at his base stats and say, well, he turns the puck over a lot. And that is true. Relative to the other Jets, he is among the top giveaways on the team, because he's often the one carrying the puck more than almost anyone else. If you're talking about a guy who has one of the highest involvements in the game every time he's on the ice, Ehlers is one of the most involved skaters of any Jets player, which means he is carrying the puck a lot. And when you do that, guess what? You're going to get hit with all the giveaways because you're the one trying to make things happen. And so it actually doesn't really track that he's all that careless with the puck. Now, he does make some risky passes and sometimes he gets punished for them, but I would say they're not really at a higher level than you tend to see with guys like Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, and the others. It's just because for whatever reason, Ehlers is held to a different standard than the other players. He usually gets punished for them a little more harshly than a lot of his colleagues. But in terms of what he brings to the Jets, there's no mistaking the fact that once he leaves, the Jets are going to have a huge hole. And as much as I like Lambert, and I think he is primed for a great future, asking him right off the bat to fill that gap is going to be a monumental task. I know that Ehlers may not play as much as he should, but I promise you his absence is very noticeable every time he's either injured or gets benched. It's just a different team without him. And, I've really struggled to figure out how to wrap my mind around the fact that the relationship has now deteriorated to the point where, the Jets are shopping him. He is a rare breed of player. I think he's going to be hard to replace. And I think that whatever the Jets get in exchange is just not going to be on the same level. I think you're most likely to get a package of like a more modest tier of roster player, maybe a prospect or a pick or something, just nothing that immediately replaces his high-end skill set. Necas probably would have been the closest fit, and even Necas doesn't really bring the level of transition offense that Ehlers does. Nik is a zone entry and offensive zone monster. Necas is not. His game is totally different. So this is going to be a tough one, right? Now, as much as I would like to see an extension, the other part of me has kind of come to grips with the fact that he's almost 30. He does get injured a lot, and the Jets probably have to be somewhat careful as to how many other veterans they sign long-term. Now, if you were offering me a choice between Ehlers and Kyle Connor, the decision is easy. It's Ehlers. But if you're asking me which one I think the Jets are going to do, it's definitely Connor. He's an everyday, every down kind of player. He doesn't get hurt that often. He scores lots of goals, and that always looks good for the Jets. But I think if you're looking at their overall impact on the ice, KFC is one of those guys who certainly scores a lot, but he gives up even more. And when Ehlers is on the ice, especially with Scheifele and Velarde, you noticed how much more dominant the Jets' shifts were. That line completely overtook most of the competition it faced. And I think when we're talking about ways to kind of mask the fact that the Jets maybe don't have like an elite star in the way that, Colorado or maybe even Toronto has in some of these guys like Matthews and McKinnon and McDavid. Well, if you have a dominant first line that's producing about the same level as in the McDavid line, maybe you should kind of work on keeping that together. That's a line and a trio that was unbelievable. And they played enough games together where there was a reasonable amount of evidence that you could expect it to continue, right? Even during their dry spouts, like I mentioned earlier, they were still creating tons of chances. And so for me, it is tough, right, to know that line is out there and to know that they worked really well together, which set up so many other line combinations for you to work with, notably having Connor and Perfetti to put together potentially, who do well together actually as a duo. It makes me feel like at the end of the day, I really hope that they can find a way to make it work. But I feel like at this point, Ehlers just doesn't have an incentive to re-sign. They did mention a couple months ago that he wasn't necessarily unhappy and he wasn't demanding a trade, but he wasn't interested in re-signing. So there's maybe like one of those 10 or 20% chances that he does get convinced by Arniel to return, and maybe he's promised a top line spot. But if you ask me, I think it's probably past that point. I think his agent's probably like, yeah, let's get you out of here at the end of the contract. Or if we can find a way to make a trade work, we'll do that. So it's a tough call, man. But I think at the end of the day, Ehlers is probably done here. And it's a shame because I think his best seasons kind of went to some level of waste. And all I can hope for is that on his next team, the coaching staff really accurately understands what they have in him. But I think if somebody's trading for him, they probably know what he brings. Now, Ehlers isn't the only wild card winger that we have to chat about. There's a certain guy playing in Russia right now who has a contract through 2025, but we know from recent history, those contracts have been renegotiated a little bit. And we've seen a couple of players coming over to North America a bit prematurely. I am, of course, referring to Dmitri Rashevsky for the Jets. He is playing for Dynamo Moscow, but how much longer will he play there? We'll chat about that in just a moment. But before we go too much further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. I love sports, and I love them so much that I wished they would never end. But of course, the NHL playoffs are over. There's not as much to watch in the typical offseason. I guess this is one of the rare instances where we have the Olympics, and I hope you've been watching because it's been pretty exciting for a lot of you Team Canada fans. I'm sure the women's national team for football has been an unbelievable story despite all the scandals and stuff around them. The players have really not backed down, and they have managed to work their way into the quarters. So congrats to them. But for the rest of you who maybe don't watch the Olympics or are more into domestic sports, you're looking for some action, right? And FanDuel wants to help you have all the fun you want and keep your summers hotter than ever by offering you a great app that lets you dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is also hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. Head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about, some big winger questions for the Jets. Obviously, Winnipeg's wing depth is probably better than its center depth, but it's also not at the level to where you can't find improvement, right? We've heard a lot about getting 5 to 10% better, from Scott O'Neill. And some of that means that you have to find offense from other sources. And that's where I think a guy like Dmitri Rashevsky is a very intriguing prospect. Rashevsky is one of those players who, to me, has maybe gone a little bit under the radar thanks to the breakouts of guys like Chibrikov, Lambert, and of course the whole McGroarty saga. But Rashevsky has been somebody that has been a player I've kept an eye on for a while now, in part because when he was drafted in the 5th round a few years ago, a lot of people said that he was a profile that actually matches a lot of Winnipeg's current drafted players. A pretty strong skater, a relentless motor for offense, a guy who's going to crash the slot and try to score goals with a pretty decent release, smart playmaking instincts, and a good sense of space. Now, I think there was some question about what his ceiling was, and so far, based on his current stay in the KHL, he's looking to be a pretty darn good middle sixer. I don't know if he really has top 6 potential these days, but at 23 years of age, he's scored 43 points in 67 games this past season, which, is pretty dang good. I think you could probably prorate something around 30 points. I forget what the exact equivalency for the KHL to the NHL is these days. The KHL has kind of declined over the last few years, and so it's not, as strong a league as it used to be, but it's still pretty good. And with all that in mind, a young 23-year-old winger having, multiple seasons of close to around 40 points. This past year, he broke that, I think is pretty impressive. And when you watch the way that he scores, he's got a pretty filthy release. He's got great stick handling, super skilled player. And one of the biggest questions with him is if he's willing to come over to the North American side of things before his contract with Dynamo Moscow ends. Now, on the one hand, there is perhaps a tough sell for Rashevsky here. He's going to have to come to North America, and I think he's going to face the same thing that McGroarty did, where they're going to tell him, look, you're going to fight for a spot, but we cannot guarantee you that you're going to stick with a big club to start. I think that is probably a very real scenario. I think he's probably looking at the right wing depth and thinking, am I going to be able to beat out Mason Appleton? Because the Jets very much love Mason. I think that they have made that clear repeatedly. And when you think about the fact that Chibrikov is also fighting for a spot, and you've got guys like Iafallo who can also play out wide, you start to realize there's actually a fair bit of competition, and some of it, you could argue, isn't necessarily the kind of competition that's equal footing because, Appleton plays the PK and stuff, and the Jets are one of those teams that really likes to have those grittier, forechecky kind of guys playing in their bottom 6. So, Rashevsky would really have to kind of come out swinging and really impress for a top 6 role. And he's going to face competition from Perfetti, from Velarde, and from some other guys for those kinds of spots. And so, honestly, he doesn't have as clear a pathway to a roster spot unless he has a massive preseason, which probably means, he would spend a year with the Moose. And if you're Rashevsky and you're thinking, do I just stick out one more year with Moscow and see if I can't come back after that? Maybe he views that as the better option. I think the McGroarty thing may also have some level of impact. Rucker wasn't willing to fight for a spot in the same way because he also wasn't really promised a roster spot either. And Rashevsky, I can't really see getting an immediate offer. But the other thing is Rashevsky's actually been playing pro hockey for several years now. So he's got quite a bit of a leg up on McGroarty, who'd be coming fresh-faced out of college. And Rashevsky never really had the skating issues that McGroarty did. So in my mind, he's a more complete prospect at this stage. He's also a few years older, so that does play a role in it. But he's been playing at a pretty high level of hockey for several years now and doing pretty well. For me, I would love to see him come over this summer. When asked about it a few weeks ago, Chevy kind of seemed not necessarily evasive, but he did seem to imply that they've been talking to Rashevsky's agent, and there wasn't an immediate sense that Dmitri was willing to come over right now. All that said, I view him as a bit of a wild card because if he does come over, suddenly you have a guy who maybe his ceiling is a little bit higher than some of the other prospects we have, right? I would put him, maybe a step below Shibrikov right now. Shibrikov has been doing so well at the AHL level and is also a bit younger that for me, I think he is one of our most talented prospects. I think he really doesn't get enough credit for being, a top 5 piece in our system. He is a monster. And I think this year he's going to have a really big rookie season for the Jets. So long as he stays healthy, I think he is primed for a surprise, 25 to 30 points, perhaps in a prime, middle six role. I'm excited for him. I think he's a very cool young player. I think he is exactly the kind of upgrade the Jets have been talking about when trying to squeeze out offense from the bottom 6. He's got a nasty, nasty release. And Rashevsky, to me, is kind of in a similar mold. Both guys are relentless in the corners. I think that they're going to be, absolute siege engines of offense, just constantly taking shots, looking to set up plays. And even if Rashevsky maybe waits a little bit longer, I still think he'll have a noticeable impact for the Jets. My biggest thing is I'd rather him start it earlier, right? Come to North America sooner. I think injuries, rookie struggles, perhaps some trades, stuff like that's going to naturally open up spots. And I think Rashevsky has a real chance to actually earn something if he spends a little bit of time with the Moose. Kick it off here, get used to North American ice, get used to the AHL level of competition, and naturally at some point you're going to get a call-up. I think the Jets have very clearly communicated they want to play the youth. I think that there is a real desire to, and Rashevsky is 23. You don't really want him to get to the age of like 25, 26 before he finally comes over. We've seen KHLers do that before plenty of times, but if you get them earlier when they're in their younger and more prime years, you can get them up to speed faster, and maybe Rashevsky has a higher ceiling than what it looks like so far. I'm very interested in seeing what his thought process is. He is, quite frankly, found money when it comes to prospects. He was a 5th-round pick, very skilled. At the time, I think a lot of people were looking at him as like a quality 3rd or 4th liner, but there's a chance that he does have the ability to play in an elevated role. I think his scoring rates have looked really respectable. He is, not a particularly small player. He's like 6'1", and, I think he'll be a really fun attacker for a Jets team that wants to get faster, more skilled, and younger. And in my mind, I really can't see any better way to do that than to lure Rashevsky over to the Jets. I think Winnipeg has a real chance to have a player who could actually sneak into Winnipeg's middle 6 through a really impressive preseason. Maybe he starts on the 4th line. I don't know. But if you ask me, the Jets have a surprising number of really talented Russian wingers. And, Shibrikov already came over. Why not Rashevsky? Maybe Dimitri's time is now. I think this is a great opportunity. I think you want to do this sooner than later. The longer he stays over there, it's just less time that he can become an impact player at the AHL or NHL level. And honestly, the Moose could really use the extra scoring helps with some of the departures that they're likely to see with Shcherbakov and Lambert both departing most likely. That means that there's going to be some prime top 6 spots for the Moose, and that's going to be a fast-tracked way to get yourself on the Jets. So, I know that there is some risk for him to maybe sacrifice some salary, but the earlier you do it, I think it's going to be a better long-run thing when it comes to getting onto this Jets roster, because Winnipeg will have some openings, and I think that they're going to open up sooner than it may look right now. So, lots of fun stuff there. He's a real wild card because his skill level is very high, and I think he would actually acclimate to North America pretty quickly. Whether he wants to do it, we'll have to wait and see. But I would be keeping an eye on him for now, right? Let's not write it off. I think it's probably something in like the 30% range that he comes over. But hey, maybe something surprising happens. We saw Matvei Michkov come over to the Flyers, although Michkov is obviously a higher tier of prospect and, would be fighting for a bigger role with the Flyers. But hey, Rashevsky still has a good chance to make this team. So something to keep an eye on. But of course, while we're kind of talking a little bit about the future, one other thing that I was thinking about a little bit much further, thankfully, down the road, but still something to consider is what happens when Hellebuyck finally ends his time with the Jets? What is life after Hellebuyck even going to be like? I've kind of thought about this off and on because, Hellebuyck is, like 30, 31 now? And with the number of seasons that he's likely to play at an elite level, you do wonder if it's going to be beyond 4 or 5 at this rate. We've got some prospects in the pool that could eventually become backups or something. But if you're asking me, I don't think the Jets really have an immediate must-sign starter in the pool. I haven't seen it yet. It's still very early to even be talking about this. But let's talk about some potential scenarios here in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, for all of you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, if you find yourselves having to turn down the volume because there's too much shouting, I recommend making the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some thoughts on Winnipeg's long-term future. I know it's obviously a very big tomorrow problem. Not really something that any of us are thinking about for the foreseeable future, but at some point, all good things must come to an end. And I think that's especially true with Hellebuyck, who, let's be real, we do not have a replacement for Hellebuyck. The fact that you have a 2-time Vezina winner on your roster is something that I think a lot of people maybe don't talk about enough. It's an exceptionally rare thing, and you may only see this once in your lifetime. Hellebuyck is truly a gem of a goalie, and it's why I've really wanted the Jets to make the most of his top seasons while he's still here. Because, this dude, you just don't come across goalies like this very often. I know that it may seem like there's a fair few number of elite goalies out there, but look at Ottinger. Look at Saros. Look at some of the other guys. Look how much they've kind of gone up and down in their performances. Look how long it took Bobrovsky to get his own Stanley Cup ring. And look at the quality that we've seen from Hellebuyck for the last 5 or 6 years. The guy is as consistent a workhorse as they come. And so far, he doesn't yet have much to show for it. But, at the end of the day, at some point, he's going to not be an NHL caliber starter anymore, whether it's age or injury or something. Maybe his contract just runs out and the Jets can't afford to bring him back. One way or another, he's going to end his time here. And life after Hellebuyck remains a massive question. We don't have any prospects that I think are immediately ready to step up once he departs. Now, projecting, you could say Milic might have an inside track. Milic has done okay with the Moose. First pro year or so has been, not a ton there yet. DiVincentis, I think, is a lot of hype for a prospect who, went back to Brampton and was kind of, okay. But other than that, right, there's just, I wouldn't say that there's an immediate goalie in our system who looks like a real full-time starter. We have players who could at some point become something, but I think projecting them at this point beyond, the next few seasons in the minor leagues is hard. I do think Milic is likely to become the backup here in a couple of seasons, and I'd be very curious to know how he does there. Hellebuyck, of course, just signed that big 8-year deal, so it's not really going to be a consideration for some time. But maybe by year 5 or 6, you start to look at the longer-term future and whether Hellebuyck figures into it, right? Helly, by age 35, 36, 37, what's his body going to look like? What is his on-ice performance going to look like? This team's core is going to be completely different. And you do wonder if he's maybe going to swap spots and become a backup, right? Obviously, that is, again, a very big tomorrow problem. And I mean, many tomorrows ahead. But I think it shows why it's really important for the Jets to sort of figure out their roster sooner than later and take advantage of these prime years while you still have them. Helly has put up monster seasons the last few years and really doesn't have much playoff success to show for it. Whether that's on him, on the roster, on the front office, I'm sure that there's a lot that goes into that. The coaching staff certainly has a role in this, but at some point you have to really reckon with the fact that he is getting older, and there's not a guarantee that he's always going to be putting Vezina finalist and Vezina winning seasons for the foreseeable future. So really imperative that they can kind of get the score turned over here pretty quickly once that starts to be a thing. And look, he may never win a cup with the Jets, but I feel like he is good enough to get one somewhere. I really hope he does it with Winnipeg. I think I've dreamed of him being the guy in net who carries us through a big postseason run, who has like that, that Braden Holtby magic save moment that really captures your heart and, basically burns itself into your mind forever. And if there's, a handful of players on this team that I am like dying to see hoist a championship title, he's one of them, and I've had a hard time imagining life without Helly. This team without him is just not the same Jets. And I know that sounds silly. You could argue that for a number of players, but Helly in particular has been such a core piece of this team's identity and how they've found success over the years that it's almost impossible to imagine life without him. And one day that's going to happen. So before that does, please, for the love of all that is good and holy, let's get a deep playoff run. Let's see Helly hoist a cup, and let's see him do it for the Jets. I think that there is a very real scenario and a pathway where the Jets can get back to being that good, but it's going to take some work and time, and I'm hoping that our recent crop of young prospects starts to contribute towards pushing that forward. But it is a lot of pressure on the kids. It's a lot of pressure on even the veterans, so let's just hope that, starting this coming season, we get back on the path to Jets greatness. But let me know what you're thinking about in terms of a future starter for the Jets. Do you think that one of our prospects is going to rise up to the challenge? Drop your thoughts in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Winnipeg Jets your first listen of the day. And while you're at it, make your second listen the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. It's free to subscribe. Of course, it's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for listening, folks. Happy August. We'll see you back here tomorrow. So don't go anywhere. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.